Hey everyone, my name is Rachel and today we are diving back into a book I've looked at very briefly before, titled Created to be His Helpmeet by Debi Pearl. Now this is the woman who is the wife of the man who wrote the book to train up a child, which we looked at in two of the videos last week. That book was responsible for some horrific child abuse and also sadly the deaths of some poor children. So that's a pretty horrible book. This book by Debi Pearl, it's not as bad because it doesn't encourage violence against children, but it's still pretty bad in a lot of ways. And in my last video on this book, I only touched on the first couple of chapters. I didn't really get into the meat of the book, and you know, I think the Pearls have a lot of wisdom that we need to tap into, and I think this book has a lot of potential that I didn't really cover before. Last time I only covered the first 2 or 3 chapters, but now I've read the whole book, and thankfully, as I said, it's not as bad as To Train Up a Child, but it's still full of unnecessarily mean comments about other women. It's full of cruel judgments, misogyny, homophobia, and it's got a lot of kind of gross, overly graphic sexual content, which is kind of unpleasant, I'll be honest. Also, it's strangely naive for a woman who's been married for 45 years or whatever. So it's an interesting read, to say the least. In the last video about this book, I kind of focused on the first couple of chapters and read through them. Gonna be kind of taking a slightly different strategy here. I'm gonna close the window because the train is very loud. Living next to a train station, super convenient until the trains go past at all hours of the day and you want the window open, and you can't because it's super noisy. And oh, hey Kyra! Kyra's here. Hi, Kelly! Where even was I? Basically, we're going to try a different tactic with this kind of review of the book, and I'm taking sections from throughout the whole book and putting them together into kind of little themes, and I'm going to be looking at different kind of themes throughout the book rather than a chapter at a time. I just thought it might be more useful this way and we'd cover more ground. We'll see. So today we are going to start by looking at Debi's advice for newlyweds, her stories of meeting and marrying Michael, and we're also going to be looking at some of her creepy sexual content. It's weird. I'm sorry, but we're going to do it. I figured the newlywed stuff would be really useful for me because chances are I am going to become a wife in the next couple of years. And who better to learn about that from than Debi Pearl? I mean, as we can see from this story that she opens her book with, she knows exactly how to have a happy marriage. As I described above, my marriage began rather spontaneously, but it didn't begin perfectly. In our early years, I experienced a considerable amount of defeat. On one occasion, I even threw rocks at my husband. Pretty standard for a newlywed couple, right? I mean, I kind of wish I'd known this when me and Dan first moved in together, 2 years ago or whenever it was. I think I screwed up a bit because I never threw rocks at him for a start, so that's a big problem there. And I never experienced defeat. That's another thing. When we moved in together, me and Dan, we just had some fun together. We shared the workload. We enjoyed spending time together, enjoyed decorating our home together. Yeah, there were no arguments and no rock throwing and no defeat, unfortunately, so we did that wrong. One thing I have learnt from Debi is that probably the biggest mistake that me and Dan made was splitting the tasks around the home, the chores and stuff. We split them according to our strengths, not our genitals. Apparently that's a big no-no. So the way we do it is things like I clean the bathroom, Dan does the ironing, and so on. I've spoken about this plenty of times. It works great for us, but apparently it's not the way it should be done. Debi says something different. Debi says, to covet his role of leadership is to covet something that will not make God, you, or him happy. It is not a question of whether or not you do a better job than he. It is a matter of doing what you were designed to do. If you successfully do the job of leading the family, you will not find satisfaction in it. It is far better that the job be done poorly by your husband than to be done well by you. I'm just gonna read that bit again in case you missed it. It is far better that the job be done poorly by your husband than be done well by you. Do I really need to explain why this is so stupid, or can I just leave that out on the table? Because I'm pretty sure you guys all have enough common sense to know why that is an idiotic thing to say. Imagine if all of society tried to function in that way. Nothing would ever get done well, nothing would ever get done properly, no progress would ever be made, because it'd all be about, who who was born for the job, not who is the best person suited to the job. So weird. Later, she goes on to claim that by the time a young woman gets married, she has developed a composite image of what her husband ought to be like. Really? Is that a thing that all women do? Because, well, by the time I get married, I'd like to think I already know my husband pretty well. I'd like to think that I actually know Dan, not just this image I have in my head. I know, just like as an example, with me and Dan, I think that me and him know each other better than like anyone else in the world knows us, right? He says the same thing. And that's how we know that we work together as a couple and a family. And after we get married, nothing's going to change there, because what really is there to change? We already live together, we share everything, things are kind of perfect. How is signing a little bit of paper going to make things any different to how they are now? It's not really. The bigger change was getting Kyra and like figuring out how we look after her and work as a team looking after her. And turns out we're pretty good at it. She seems like a happy little girl. She's currently snoring away at my feet, so if you can hear her. She says hi and also snores. But yeah, if you have some like weird made up picture in your head of what your husband should be or what you expect a husband to be, then I don't know, like, should you really be getting married? Like, especially if that image in your head isn't the same as your fiancé. Like, I don't think you should be getting married. Even if you just have this picture in your head of what a husband should be, and you don't know if that matches up to the person that you're marrying, again, I don't think you're ready to get married. It's really bizarre to me. Like, this is what dating is for, to figure out if that is the right person that you should be marrying. You shouldn't have some image of what your husband ought to be like. You should know that this man I'm engaged to is going to be my husband, and he's perfect for me because and then list the reasons that you know you and him work together. I don't know. I feel like I'm stating the obvious here, but clearly Debbie doesn't get it, so maybe it does need to be said. Going back to her own story, Debbie talks more about the early days of her marriage, and to give you guys a little bit of context, she gives a story of how her and Michael met. Apparently, she was a 13-year-old going to church, and he was 18, and like, I don't know if he was some kind of like minister or something like that, and she had this huge crush on him, and she basically kind of like followed him around and stalked him for 5 years until she turned 18 and he was like 20-something, I think. Or maybe she was 20 and he was 25, it's something like that. And then basically one day, they were all praying together, and he held her hand while they prayed. And then he drove her home, and then she turned around to him and said, "I want to have your babies one day." And then he ran away, and then like half an hour later he came back to her and said, "Let's get married." And then 8 days later they were married. Yeah. That's it. Which is no surprise we get this story from the night she was married, like the night of her wedding. She says, "I remember the night Michael and I married. My new husband decided we need to go shopping and cook a meal before we went to bed. Aye aye. I had no idea how much money he made or how much money he had for our honeymoon. Money had never been an issue in my life. Yet here we were in the grocery store at 10 p.m. on a Sunday night, having been married for less than an hour, when I first felt the critical spirit rise within me. He was picking out ground beef and was about to pay a very high price. I tried to reason with him. Don't you think that is priced too high, and wouldn't it be better to buy a cheaper priced meat?" Oh, sweetie. I know this is just the start of your story, but oh, sweetie, come on. One, if you've never had to deal with your own money, never had to budget, never had money be an issue in your life, then I'm not sure you're mature enough to get married in the first place and have your own family. Also, if you've never sat down and discussed finances before you get married, then I don't think as a couple you're ready to get married. Before me and Dan moved in together, we planned, we budgeted, we had spreadsheets, we discussed how we were going to split money, how we were going to spend our money, how we were going to pay for bills. We knew whose income was going to go towards what. We knew how much each of us was going to be earning and so on. And we set our limits together and knew what we as a couple could afford. That's the responsible thing to do. And it wasn't just the first night there were problems for Debbie. She says, "At first he," meaning Michael, "had a tendency to brush me off, attributing my irregularities to female hormones. If I got upset over something, the first thing he would do was ask me if I was on my period. I usually was, but I resented his attributing everything I did to female hormones. It seemed as though he was not taking my issues seriously. Oh, such a considerate man. I wish Dan did that with me when I was upset about something. Instead, when I'm upset, Dan just asks me what's wrong and then helps me figure out what we can do to fix it. I wish he just, was like, oh, she's been a silly woman with silly hormones again. I wish he was more like that instead. Debbie, you're really giving me something to aspire to here. Thanks. And then she goes on to just be like, oh, it was just me being a silly woman with silly hormones. He was right to call me out on it. Moving on, she goes to talk about Michael, saying he was born with an extreme amount of drive and dominance, and what seems to some, a deficit in gentleness. I say that in a complimentary way. He is a leader. He expects to be served. When he walks into a crowded room, whether in a church building or at a gas station, people are aware of his presence. Where most men walk miles in their lives, he has travelled galaxies. He has expected me to do the same. My life was never my own. Every minute of every day, I have been on call. Oh, Debbie, you're opening my eyes here. This is exactly what all women aspire to. A life that isn't their own. She goes on and on repeating a lot of these ideas before she finally claims, a woman's calling is not easy. To allow someone else to control your life is much harder than taking control of it yourself. Spoken by someone who's clearly never had to take control of life themselves. I would love to see Debbie living alone for a week, having to deal with earning her own money, managing her own budget, paying her own bills, trying to save money, just living by herself, being an independent person. I would love to see how she copes with it, just for a week. I mean, I don't know though, unless by more difficult she means unhappier, does she really think it's more difficult to just do what someone else tells you the whole time? Actually, I don't know, maybe it is. You have to squash down every basic human instinct you have and just give yourself up to another person. Yeah, I couldn't do that, I'll be honest. That seems really sucky. I wouldn't want to either. Then she goes on to talk a lot about fear. She says, fear is a big thing in relationships and marriage and so on. She says, wisdom is conceived in a strange place. It is fathered by fear. She says, our choices can bring us to miserable ends. Then fear is the healthiest deterrent we can have. Life without fear is a fool's paradise. But what is it with people like Debbie and Michael? The motivator is always fear. Why does the motivator always have to be fear? Why? Why does it always come back to do this or bad things will happen with the Pearls? It's the same with raising their kids. They're like, do this or we beat you with a large stick. It always comes back to the same thing. What's so wrong with do this good thing and get the rewards? That's how I was brought up, and I think I turned out okay. I hope. Eventually. Moving back very quickly to the early days of their marriage again, and Debbie writes, wives are very much flesh and blood, and as young women we don't come into marriage with all the skills needed to make it start out good, let alone perfect. I mean, speak for yourself, Debbie, but have you ever thought that's what dating is for? Oh, Kyra! Oh, did you guys just hear a little snort? That was so cute. I love you, girl. I love you. But seriously, Debbie, have you ever thought that maybe that's what dating is for, and bothering to take the time to date and get to know someone, not just saying, let's get married, and then doing it a week later? The thing is, with people like Debbie who go through things like that, where it's literally an 8-day turnaround from practically a stranger to, oh, your penis is in me. The thing is, with people like that, they might not have gone into marriage with any preparation. She clearly didn't go into marriage knowing her husband at all, because, trust me, it's one thing to see someone once a week at church and speak to them then. It is entirely another thing to live with a man and know him inside out, and stroke his hair while he's puking in the toilet, or sleep next to him while he's snoring away, or have to use the bathroom after him when he's had a poorly tummy. It's entirely different to live with someone day in, day out, and cook and eat and sleep beside them, to be there when they've had a sad day or a stressful day, and also to be there with them through all the good stuff and the wonderful stuff. It's entirely different to live with someone than just knowing someone. Living with someone is different from anything I've ever experienced in the past. I've lived with my family, I've lived with friends and housemates, I've lived with strangers in halls, I've lived by myself, and living with my partner is different from any of those other experiences. And I have to say, if it wasn't with Dan, it would probably be exhausting being around someone literally 24 hours a day sometimes. Anyone other than Dan and I don't think I could deal with it. But because we work so well together, living together is kind of easy for us. But we wouldn't know that unless we'd done it. And that's how we know we're good to get married in whenever is right for us. Words. So the point I'm trying to make is, because I'm rambling again as always, is that Debi might not have known this man properly before she got married. She clearly didn't go into marriage with all the skills needed to make it start out good, or whatever quote she used. And I might not have gone into dating Dan with all those skills, but I'll definitely be going into marriage with them. I can say that for certain, because we bothered to take the time to get to know each other before jumping straight into lifelong commitments and contracts and babies. She always goes on and on about how marriage isn't perfect to begin with, and marriage isn't this, and marriage isn't this, and marriage is super difficult because you don't know your husband at the start. But I can say with certainty that I don't think that's going to be the case for me and Dan, because we bothered to use this time, these years beforehand, to get to know each other. And yes, things might be difficult along the way, but it won't be because we've gone into this with our eyes closed. It'll just be because, things change in life, and we're going to have to deal with them and change with them, But we're never going to be struggling out of naivety like Debi clearly did. And I don't think she should make out that this is the normal way to go into a marriage, because this seems like a very, very unhealthy way to do things. I'd much rather do them my way, but that's just me. Feel free to ignore it if you want. Later, she goes on to make the claim that man was created to subdue, woman was created to assist. God created man with a nature that is aggressive, and then commanded him to exercise dominion over the earth. He created the male sex with an extra dose of testosterone, which provokes him to want to work hard, conquer everything in his path, and subdue all things. That is why the male sex is at the forefront of military conquests, exploration, architecture, science, inventions, etc. She might be right here, Sometimes testosterone does make men more aggressive. Sometimes it does make them want to be in control. Sometimes it does have these effects on them. But I've got to say, I'm not sure I've seen aggression in Dan. I've definitely not seen an urge to join military conquests. And I've never seen him have a need to subdue all things yet. Do you think that means Dan's not a real man? Damn, what have I done? Getting involved with a beta male. Do you think that's what he is? Disgusting. I thought Dan was strong. I thought he was wonderful. I thought he would protect me. But clearly, if he doesn't have urges to join military conquests, he's not a real man. Debi taught me that. No woman would ever go out and tame a wild horse and make a rope out of its mane and tail, and then go find a bear and lasso it just to prove she could, laughing the whole time. I don't know anyone that would do that. Never mind a woman. Actually, no, I do know a few women who like horses, a lot. They would probably do it. Can't think of any men, though. Men fly to the moon, climb treacherous mountains, fight wild animals, challenge each other at any sport, and laugh with hilarious delight the whole time. They like to play or watch games where they knock each other down, just to prove who's the strongest and the toughest. I don't think that's an exclusively male thing. I know female astronauts, I know female mountain climbers, I know female sports peoples. I think this is just a trait you find in some people, not necessarily an entire gender. And if we're talking about competitiveness in genders, I am definitely the most competitive one in our relationship, and do not let Dan tell you otherwise, okay? Seriously though, Dan is the most laid back person. I get really competitive, so when we play games like Injustice, we like to fight against each other, and I get really into it. I'm like, yeah, die, bitch! And he's like, I'm just doing my combo. She goes on and says, he, meaning man, must thoroughly conquer. It is a battle I always enjoy losing. I like to be conquered and consumed by my man. That is my created nature. Oof, Debi! Maybe getting a little too personal here, you might be into that, but Don't just assume all women are, you know? I mean, I guess while we're on this topic, this seems like a good moment to move into one of the second themes in this book. Sex. And I've got to say, for a prim, proper Christian lady, she gives away a little too much about her and her husband's private grown-up times, you know? Seriously, I don't think I want to read this stuff, but sadly I read it, and now you have to too, because as they say, a burden shared is a burden halved, and I am carrying a hell of a lot of burden now, just... ugh. Also, before we get much further into this topic, I just want to remind you who is writing this book, and who it is being written about. So you can really picture the details in your mind in depth. So there's a really gross bit where she writes this really kind of disturbingly weird and creepy story that's just really, really awkward, which she titles My Jolly Playmate. I'm gonna do a dramatic reading of this book as a bonus video for my Patreon supporters this month, and then I'll release it later on my channel. So if you're not supporting me on Patreon, keep an eye out for that on here in the future, but if you are, you can head over there and I'll link to it as I release this video. But other than that, there's some other really weird parts. For example, she writes this bit saying, "Oh, but I would be remiss in not telling you. Long hair casts a spell on men that is unparalleled. When the veil of my long hair falls about my body and hips, my old husband loses his mind. We have counselled enough men to know that this is a fantasy they all have in common." There you go again, getting all creepy and personal and speaking for all men based on a couple of little anecdotes of people you've met. I mean, potentially you may be right, you know? Maybe the majority of heterosexual men like long hair on a woman, but I can say for certain it is not all men, because I'm pretty sure a lot of gay men, for example, aren't interested sexually in women with long hair. It's just a feeling I have. She also says that one of the main rules of being a perfect helpmeet is to love your husbands. And now Debbie doesn't just mean love, but she means love, if you know what I mean. Apparently, loving him means putting his needs before your own. Every day and every night we need to be ready to minister to his needs. And then she says if a woman doesn't regularly sleep with her husband every time he wants it, then, and I quote, her half commitment makes him feel incomplete and unloved. By not obeying God in this area of sex and love, a woman is putting a terrible curse on her husband. So you hear that, ladies? If you're not in the mood when he wants it, you're putting a terrible curse on your man. Debbie says if a wife does not meet his intimacy and sexual needs, she is not a helpmeet, a helper not suitable to the task for which God created her. No woman really loves her husband if she does not seek to pleasure him in this most important area. If you are not interested in sex, then at least be interested enough in him to give him good sex. So, good advice here, if you're not in the mood to have sex, pretend you are. Sex isn't about both people, it's just about the man and making him happy. She goes on to quote Bible passages like, "The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband." And she argues that God grants the marriage partner full access to his spouse's body for sexual gratification. And this is all very reminiscent of the guy from Biblical Gender Roles. Remember I made a video on him who said it's not the woman's consent that matters but God, and that's why you can't rape your wife. It's all very reminiscent of that, which is kind of scary. So she's not advocating child abuse here, but she is kind of saying you can't rape your wife. And she's kind of encouraging wives to let themselves be raped willingly by their husbands in a weird way. It's kind of subtle, but it's there. Again, I don't want to touch on this stuff too much, but she does get creepily graphic. Few little quotes here. God made man to need sex. He must be relieved of his built-up sexual desire, even if it means spilling his seed in his sleep. A good wife knows that the greater her response, the more pleasurable her man's orgasm can be, and the more complete and long-lasting will be his satisfaction. It is your duty to fulfill his sexual needs. I call it ministering to my husband. He says I am a mighty fine minister. I feel like if it wasn't so personal, it wouldn't be so weird, but it's just knowing who the Pearls are. And then hearing these words come out of their mouth is just a bit weird. Like, okay, I'm assuming we're all grown-ups here, okay? Talking maturely about sex isn't a problem. Talking in a healthy, normal, productive way about sex is normal. But when you're like a 70-something-year-old woman talking about your 75, 76, whatever-year-old husband's orgasms in the context of, I do whatever I can to make him happy because nothing matters with me and my body, I'm secondary to him and his needs. That's what makes it creepy. The final little kind of bit she throws out here about sex at all is this little quote that just says, anal sex is a homosexual act, and no normal man or woman desires this. I feel like this is a pretty perfect opportunity to use that Shakespeare quote, you know, the lady doth protest too much, methinks. No, seriously though, it sounds more like she's trying to convince herself rather than anyone else, doesn't it? Giving away all your secrets here, aren't you, Debbie? Anyway, with that disturbing image of Debbie and Michael in the bedroom and her trying to say no, I'm gonna end this video here. As I said, there's a lot more to Debi Pearl's book, Created to be His Helpmeet, and we are going to be diving into this in another video, perhaps 2 more videos. I'm not sure, it depends how long they are. I don't know why I'm doing the hands. Yeah, it depends. In the future, we're going to touch on Debbie's weird, irrational hate of pretty much all women that aren't her. We're going to be reading some letters from Debbie's fans, who, just for funsies, I've labelled the Cult of Debbie. And we're also going to be touching on Debbie's views of how a woman's body isn't her own, and she shouldn't make decisions about what happens in her body. Only her husband can make decisions about that. So that'll be fun, right? In the meantime, let me know what you thought of Debbie's advice for newlyweds and married couples and women being submissive to their husbands at all times. Let me know what you think of her weird views about sex only being for the man and how his pleasure comes first, his experience comes first. He gets to say when and how and why it happens. The woman does not. Seriously, let me know your thoughts down in the comments, but for now, thank you so much for watching today. I really, really do appreciate it, and I'll see you guys again soon. If you like this video and you want to hear me talk more about sciencey stuff, you can check out the Here and How podcast, which I host with Rationality Rules and Holy Kool-Aid. But for now, I just want to say an extra special thank you to everyone who is supporting me on Patreon this month. You guys are incredible. A special thank you goes out to Gambit and his Chauffeur, Mark Dauner, Eric Reid, Christian Berg, Rachel B. Royer, Religion is BS, Matthew Meinema, Jaylee Moore, Sir Michael Moore, Jadeon Sheppard, Greg Ladd, and Pixelated Skeptic. Also go check out everyone who is listed down in the description and on the video end screen here. You guys are all amazing, and I cannot thank you enough.